The Johnson family had been waiting for this trip for months. Michael Johnson, a tall and calm man in his early 40s, had been working long hours at his job and barely found time to relax with his wife and 2 kids. His wife, Carla, had been dreaming about getting away from the noise of the city, and their children, Ethan and Maya, were counting the days until their family vacation would begin. When the morning finally came, their excitement filled the air, like sunlight pouring through the window. Bags were packed, snacks were ready, and laughter echoed as they prepared to leave. The journey itself felt magical. The kids pressed their faces against the car windows, pointing at every little thing they found interesting on the way. Carla kept taking pictures, capturing smiles and silly faces. Michael, though quiet at times, wore a proud smile as he drove. For him, the happiness of his family was the most important thing. They were heading toward a small coastal town, known for its beaches, local shops, and friendly atmosphere, or at least that was what they had been told. When they arrived, the town looked just like a postcard. The ocean breeze carried the smell of salt and grilled seafood. Seagulls circled in the sky, and bright umbrellas lined the shore. Carla felt her heart lighten. Ethan ran toward the sand the moment they parked, while Maya held her father's hand tightly, her little eyes wide with excitement. It felt like everything was perfect. This was supposed to be their time of peace, away from work stress and city troubles. The first few days were filled with joy. They went swimming, tried local dishes, and even rented bikes to explore the winding streets near the coast. At night, they sat together by the hotel balcony, telling stories and enjoying the sound of waves. Michael felt grateful. He rarely had the chance to slow down, and watching his children laugh freely gave him more satisfaction than anything else. But underneath the warmth of their family fun, small things began to catch Michael's attention. He noticed stares from certain locals, not everyone, but enough to make him uncomfortable. When they entered a restaurant one afternoon, the waiter's smile vanished the moment he saw them. Carla felt it too, but tried to brush it off. "Maybe he's just having a bad day," she whispered. Michael nodded, though his instincts told him otherwise. On another day, while walking through a busy marketplace, Michael realized 2 uniformed officers were watching them closely. At first, he didn't think much of it. Maybe they were just patrolling. But then he noticed the way the officers kept whispering to each other while their eyes stayed fixed on his family. He didn't mention it to Carla because he didn't want to ruin the kids' fun. But in his heart, he knew something wasn't right. Still, he tried to focus on making the vacation memorable. Ethan wanted to build the biggest sandcastle on the beach, and Michael helped him gather buckets of wet sand. Maya collected seashells with Carla, giggling each time she found a new one. The children had no idea that their father's eyes kept drifting toward the boardwalk, scanning for those officers who seemed to appear more often than coincidence allowed. One evening, as the sun painted the sky orange and pink, the Johnson family sat down at an outdoor cafe. The air was soft, the music was gentle, and for a while everything felt perfect again. Carla leaned across the table, her eyes sparkling. "This is exactly what we needed," she said. Michael smiled and held her hand. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to forget the uneasy looks, the whispers, and the shadows of suspicion. But deep down, Michael knew the calm would not last. He had lived long enough to understand that peace for his family was always fragile and too often interrupted by prejudice that waited like a storm beyond the horizon. For now, he let his children laugh and enjoy their ice cream, knowing that tomorrow might not be as kind. This was only the beginning of their vacation, and none of them could have guessed how quickly it would change. The Johnson family thought they came to this town for rest, but fate was about to turn their holiday into a lesson in justice, power, and truth. The next morning began with bright sunlight streaming into the hotel room. Carla opened the curtains, letting the ocean breeze drift inside. The children were already up, bouncing with excitement about exploring the town again. Michael stretched, forcing himself to leave behind the nagging thoughts from yesterday. He wanted this trip to be nothing but happiness for his family. Yet, the unease from the stares and whispers kept replaying in his mind. He reminded himself not to overthink, but deep inside, a quiet voice warned him that something was building. After breakfast, they headed out to stroll through the town square. It was busy, full of tourists snapping photos and locals selling crafts at colorful stalls. Ethan tugged at his dad's sleeve, begging for a toy sailboat, while Maya clung to Carla's hand, curious about every little thing. For a while, everything seemed normal. Michael even allowed himself to relax as they laughed and tried local candies from a vendor. But then he noticed them again. 2 uniformed police officers leaned against a patrol car parked near the square. Their eyes didn't casually scan the crowd like officers usually did. They stayed locked on the Johnson family. Michael felt his stomach tighten. The officers whispered to each other, and one even pointed in their direction before quickly turning away. Carla noticed too this time. "Michael, do you see them?" she whispered, trying not to alarm the kids. He gave a small nod, keeping his voice calm. "Don't worry, just stay close." He didn't want to ruin the day, but his instincts told him the officers weren't simply patrolling. As they continued exploring, the officers followed at a distance. Whenever the family stopped, the patrol car seemed to pause too. Carla grew restless. "This doesn't feel right," she muttered, her voice low. Michael placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "I'll handle it. Just keep walking." They turned into a side street filled with shops selling souvenirs. Inside one store, Carla pretended to browse while whispering to her husband, "Why are they watching us? We haven't done anything." Michael's jaw tightened, but he spoke gently. "Sometimes people don't need a reason. Sometimes they just look for one." The tension grew heavier when the family returned to the square. The officers approached at last, walking directly toward them. Michael felt the shift in the air. Tourists nearby slowed their steps, sensing drama. Ethan clutched his toy tightly, and Maya hid behind her mother's arm. "Excuse me," one officer said sharply, blocking their path. "Can we see some identification?" His tone wasn't polite. It was demanding, almost accusatory. Michael raised an eyebrow. "Is there a reason you're stopping us?" His voice was calm but firm. "You match a description," the second officer muttered vaguely. "We've had reports of suspicious individuals in the area." Carla's face paled. "Suspicious? We're here on vacation with our children." She gestured to Ethan and Maya, who were now clinging tightly to her. The first officer ignored her and kept his eyes fixed on Michael. "Sir, I'll need you to provide ID." Michael reached for his wallet slowly, careful not to make any sudden moves. Years of training had taught him how quickly situations like this could spiral. He handed over his driver's license without a word. The officer glanced at it, then smirked. "Out of town, huh? What exactly brings you here?" "We're on holiday," Michael answered evenly, "just like everyone else." The officer exchanged a look with his partner, then said, "We're going to need you all to come with us for a few more questions," Carla gasped. "What? Why? We haven't done anything." "Ma'am, calm down," the officer said coldly. "We just need to make sure everything checks out." The crowd around them began to grow, curious bystanders whispering as they pulled out their phones to record. Ethan started crying, his little voice trembling. "Dad, what's happening?" Michael knelt down, placing both hands on his son's shoulders. "It's okay, buddy, just stay strong. I'm right here." Inside, Michael's patience was thinning, but he knew better than to escalate in public. Still, the blatant injustice burned. His children were being frightened. His wife, humiliated, and for what? Because they fit some false image of suspicious? The officers moved closer, one reaching for handcuffs. Carla's voice cracked with panic. "You can't just arrest us. We haven't done anything wrong." But her words were ignored. The cuffs snapped shut around Michael's wrists with a harsh click. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Ethan screamed, "Daddy!" while Maya buried her face in Carla's dress, sobbing. Michael lifted his chin, keeping his voice steady despite the fire inside him. "It's okay," he told his family, forcing a calm tone. "Don't cry. Stay together. I'll take care of this." As the officers began leading him away, tourists shouted in protest. Some filmed, others muttered in disbelief. Carla, her voice shaking with anger, demanded, "Where are you taking him?" "To the station," one officer replied coldly. "You can come along if you want answers." The moment was surreal. What was supposed to be a day of family fun had turned into a nightmare. The Johnsons had become the center of a public spectacle, treated as criminals without cause. What the officers didn't know, what no one there could have guessed, was that the man they had just handcuffed wasn't just another tourist. Michael Johnson was an FBI agent, someone who knew the law better than the men arresting him, someone who had the power to turn this entire situation upside down. And soon, the truth would surface. The ride to the station was silent, except for the hum of the patrol car's engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio. Michael sat in the back seat, his hands locked in cold steel cuffs, the leather seat pressing against his back. He kept his eyes steady, unblinking, fixed on the road ahead. Inside, though, he was burning. Every second, he thought of Ethan's terrified face, Maya's tears, and Carla's cries. His family had only come to enjoy a simple vacation, yet here they were being treated like criminals for no reason. Carla sat in the seat beside him, trying her best to comfort the kids. Ethan clung to her arm, still trembling, while Maya sniffled quietly, her small hands clutching her mother's dress. Carla's eyes darted from her husband to the officers in the front. She wanted to scream, to demand they stop, but she held back. She knew her husband well enough to understand he was keeping calm for a reason. If Michael wasn't shouting, then she couldn't either. At the station, they were marched inside. The officers didn't bother to lower their voices, speaking openly about keeping an eye on people like this. The words stabbed deep, but Michael kept his composure. He observed everything. The way they handled paperwork, the sloppiness in procedure, the arrogance in their tone. Years of training had taught him patience. Every mistake they made was another weapon in his hands later. They forced the family into a small waiting room. A harsh fluorescent light flickered above, casting a pale glow over the cracked table and worn chairs. Michael was seated apart from Carla and the kids, still handcuffed, while two officers began asking questions. "Where are you from?" One asked sharply. "Why are you here?" The other pressed. "How long have you been in town?" Michael answered each question calmly, refusing to let them see anger in his eyes. His voice was steady, measured and polite. But every answer only seemed to irritate them more, as if they were searching for a reason that didn't exist. Carla finally snapped. "This is harassment. You have no reason to keep us here. We've done nothing wrong. We're just on vacation with our children." Her voice cracked with frustration. The officer smirked. "Ma'am, calm down. We'll decide what's wrong and what isn't." The words made Michael's jaw clench. He wanted to intervene, but he knew it wasn't the right time. Instead, he let them talk, let them dig their own hole deeper with every arrogant word. Minutes stretched into an hour. The children grew restless, their fear shifting into exhaustion. Ethan leaned against Carla, his eyes drooping, while Maya quietly hummed to herself, trying to drown out the tension in the room. Michael's heart ached, but he stayed still. His time to speak would come. Finally, a senior officer entered the room. His uniform was crisp, his demeanor more professional. He glanced at the family, then at the younger officers, his brows furrowing. "What's going on here?" One officer quickly stood straighter. These people were acting suspicious. "We brought them in for questioning." The senior officer's gaze hardened. "Suspicious? How?" There was a pause. The younger officers exchanged looks, fumbling for words. They matched a description, one muttered. The senior officer sighed, clearly unimpressed. Show me the paperwork. As the younger men scrambled to justify their actions, Michael lifted his eyes and finally spoke. His voice was calm, but carried a weight that demanded attention. Perhaps I can clear this up. The room quieted instantly. Michael leaned forward, his hands still cuffed, and said, My name is Michael Johnson. I am a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. For a heartbeat, silence hung heavy in the air. Then came the shock. The senior officer's eyes widened slightly, and the two younger officers froze in place, their mouths half open, unable to speak. Carla sat straighter, her eyes shining with a mix of relief and anger. Ethan looked at his father with awe, while Maya whispered softly, Daddy? Michael nodded toward his daughter reassuringly before turning his gaze back to the officers. I've been patient, he said evenly, but I've watched every move you've made since this morning, every violation of procedure, every unnecessary word. I let you continue because I wanted to see how far you'd go, and you've gone far enough. The senior officer cleared his throat nervously. Agent Johnson, if that's true, then of course we'll... Michael cut him off. It is true. My credentials are in my wallet, which your officer has already seen. He didn't care to check. Instead, he chose to escalate. His eyes swept across the room. You humiliated my family, terrified my children, and arrested us without cause. Do you have any idea what that means for this department? The color drained from the younger officers' faces. The senior officer tried to regain control. Agent Johnson, I can assure you this was a misunderstanding. We'll fix this immediately. Michael's voice turned colder. No, this isn't just a misunderstanding. This is abuse of power, and I will not let it slide. Carla's lips curled into a small, fierce smile. For the first time since the ordeal began, she saw the tide turning. The officers shifted uncomfortably, the weight of their mistake pressing down on them. The room, once filled with arrogance and authority, now felt suffocating with fear. They hadn't just arrested a random family. They had targeted the wrong man, and for the first time, Michael allowed himself a small smile. Because now, justice was in his hands. The room fell into an uneasy silence after Michael's reveal. The younger officers who had cuffed him stood stiffly by the wall, their bravado gone. The senior officer shifted awkwardly, tugging at his collar as if the weight of his uniform suddenly felt heavier. Carla sat taller now, her eyes sharp, no longer pleading, but daring them to deny what her husband had just declared. Ethan and Maya, though still shaken, clung to her with quiet hope. Michael leaned back slightly in his chair, the cuffs still tight around his wrists, but his posture radiated control. His calm voice carried authority that could not be ignored. You've made serious mistakes today. Unlawful detention, racial profiling, intimidation of minors. Do you understand the gravity of that? The senior officer cleared his throat, searching for words. Agent Johnson, I'm sure this can be resolved. If you'll just... Michael interrupted, his tone firm but measured. Resolved? You think a simple apology will resolve this? My children cried in fear while your officers paraded me through the streets like a criminal. My wife was humiliated in front of strangers. And you want to sweep this under the rug? Carla's hand tightened around Maya's shoulder. She had spent the past hour swallowing her anger, but now she allowed herself a small, satisfied nod. For once, the people who had looked down on them were being forced to listen. The senior officer tried again, his voice shaky. Perhaps we could remove the cuffs and talk in private? Michael extended his hands forward slowly. That would be a start. One of the younger officers hesitated before fumbling with the key. His hands trembled as he unlocked the cuffs. The cold steel fell away, leaving faint red marks on Michael's wrists. He rubbed them gently, his expression unreadable, then fixed his gaze back on the men. "You knew nothing about me, yet you assumed guilt based only on the color of my skin and the sight of my family," he said, each word cutting through the room. "You wanted to assert power. Now you'll answer for it." The younger officer stammered, We were just following protocol." Michael's eyes narrowed. "No, you weren't. Protocol doesn't include false accusations or harassing families on vacation. I've trained officers myself. I know the difference between genuine suspicion and prejudice dressed up as authority." The senior officer shifted uneasily, then finally gestured toward the door. "Agent Johnson, why don't we step into my office and discuss this further?" Michael glanced at Carla, who gave him a reassuring look. He stood, tall and steady, and followed the senior officer down the hallway. Carla whispered to the children, "It's going to be okay now," though her voice still trembled with the weight of everything they had endured. Inside the office, the senior officer closed the door and lowered his voice. "Listen, I understand. You're upset. What happened shouldn't have occurred. I'll file a report and see to it the officers are reprimanded." Michael folded his arms. "Reprimanded? That's not enough. Do you think a slap on the wrist erases the trauma they inflicted on my family? Do you think my children will forget the sight of their father being handcuffed for no reason?" The senior officer swallowed hard. What do you want then?" Michael leaned forward, his voice icy calm. "I want this documented. I want Internal Affairs notified immediately, and I want every piece of body cam footage pulled. If you don't handle it, I will, and believe me, the Bureau will not take kindly to the way this department treated one of their own." The officer paled, realizing the weight of the threat. He nodded quickly. "Of course, I'll make the calls right away." Back in the waiting room, Carla whispered soothing words to Maya and Ethan, though her own nerves were still frayed. When Michael returned a few minutes later, his expression was stern but resolute. He bent down to his children, smoothing Ethan's hair and kissing Maya's forehead. "It's over," he murmured. "Daddy took care of it." But it wasn't truly over. Word spread quickly through the station. Officers in the hall avoided looking at the family as they passed. Some whispered among themselves, clearly shaken by what had unfolded. A few looked ashamed, others simply fearful of the consequences. Carla rose to her feet, holding her children close. "Can we go now?" she asked softly, though her eyes still carried fire. Michael nodded. "Yes, but not before I finish something." He turned back toward the senior officer, who lingered nervously nearby. "You owe my wife and children an apology," Michael said firmly. "Right here, right now." The man hesitated, his pride warring with the reality of the situation. Then, under Michael's unwavering stare, he finally bowed his head slightly. "Mrs. Johnson, children, I apologize for the way you were treated. It was wrong." Carla's lips pressed into a thin line. "You're right. It was wrong." Her voice trembled, but her strength was clear. With that, the Johnson family left the station. Outside, the night air felt cooler, sharper, like a release of pressure. The crowd that had once gathered around their arrest was gone, but the memory of their humiliation lingered. Tourists had filmed everything, and Michael knew it wouldn't be long before the videos began spreading online. As they walked back toward their hotel, Ethan tugged at his father's hand. "Dad, are they gonna get in trouble?" Michael looked down at his son, his expression softening. "Yes, son, they will. Because when people do wrong, they have to be held accountable. That's how change begins." For the first time that day, Ethan managed a small smile. Maya leaned against Carla, finally drifting into calmness. Carla walked beside her husband, pride mixing with relief. She had always known Michael was strong, but tonight he had shown just how powerful calm dignity could be in the face of cruelty. And though the vacation had been scarred, their story was far from over, because the fallout from this night was only just beginning. The Johnson family returned to their hotel late that night, exhausted but unable to shake the weight of what had happened. The children fell asleep quickly, their small bodies drained by the fear and confusion of the day. Carla tucked them in gently, brushing hair from their foreheads as though her touch alone could protect them. Michael stood by the window, staring out at the dimly lit street below. The station's harsh fluorescent lights still burned in his memory, as did the sight of the cuffs on his wrists and the tears on his children's faces. Carla joined him at the window, her voice quiet but firm. "You did the right thing. You held it together." Michael sighed, rubbing the red marks left by the cuffs. "It shouldn't take an FBI badge for people to be treated with dignity. That's what keeps me up tonight." What neither of them realized was that the incident had already begun to spread beyond the walls of the station. Tourists who had filmed the arrest uploaded the videos to social media. By morning, clips of Michael being cuffed in front of his children had gone viral. Hashtags about injustice and racial profiling trended across platforms. Outrage grew, with each share with strangers demanding answers. When Michael woke the next morning, his phone was buzzing non-stop. Calls, texts, and emails poured in. Colleagues from the bureau had already seen the footage. Some messages carried sympathy, others outrage, but all made one thing clear: this was no longer a private humiliation. It had become a public reckoning. Carla looked over his shoulder as he scrolled through the endless stream of notifications. "It's everywhere, isn't it?" Michael nodded. "Yes, and now there's no hiding from it." Meanwhile, at the police station, panic spread through the department. The senior officer who had tried to smooth things over now faced calls from city officials demanding explanations. The officers who made the arrest were placed on immediate suspension pending investigation. Internal Affairs had already opened a case, and representatives from the mayor's office wanted answers before the day was over. But the damage was far beyond the department. News outlets picked up the story quickly. Headlines described A. Black family arrested on vacation without cause, and FBI agent handcuffed by racist cops. The images were powerful. Michael's calm face against the brutality of handcuffs, Carla's protective stance beside crying children, the arrogance of officers frozen forever on film. The hotel lobby buzzed with whispers when the Johnsons walked. Through that morning, some people stared with pity, others with admiration. One guest quietly approached Michael, shaking his hand. "What they did to you was wrong," the man said. "We're all talking about it. The whole country's talking about it." Carla felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, pride, and unease. She hadn't wanted their family vacation to become a national headline. Yet part of her knew that maybe this was bigger than them now. Maybe this was a chance for truth to be seen. Back in their room, Michael sat the children down. His voice was gentle, his eyes steady. "What happened to us was wrong, but I want you both to remember something. When people try to make you feel small, you don't let them break you. You stay strong. You tell the truth. And you never, ever let fear win." Ethan nodded, still clutching his toy sailboat, while Maya curled closer into Carla's side. Later that day, Michael received a call from his bureau director. The man's tone was serious. "Agent Johnson, we've seen the footage. We're backing you fully, but I want you to understand, this won't just affect those officers. It's going to send ripples across law enforcement." Michael replied calmly, "Then let the ripples spread. Maybe it's time." Outside, protesters had already begun gathering near the police station. Signs demanding justice waved in the air. Local leaders called for accountability. The town, that once looked picture-perfect, now stood at the center of a storm it couldn't contain. Inside their hotel room, Michael held Carla's hand tightly. "We didn't ask for this," he murmured. Carla squeezed his hand back. "No, But maybe we were meant to be here. Maybe this happened because people need to see what's really going on. That night, national news anchors spoke about the Johnson family. Their story was no longer just about a ruined vacation. It was about injustice that reached far beyond one town. Viewers across the country watched the videos, saw the children's tears, and asked themselves how many other families had endured the same without the shield of an FBI badge to protect them. Michael stood by the balcony, looking out at the ocean he had hoped to enjoy with his family. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing against him, heavier than the cuffs had been. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every father, every mother, every child who deserved respect. The vacation they had dreamed of was gone. In its place stood something larger, louder, and more powerful, a moment of truth that could not be ignored. And Michael knew this was only the beginning. The Johnsons woke to the sound of knocking on their hotel room door. It wasn't the quiet tap of housekeeping. It was firm, official. Michael moved first, his instincts alert. He opened the door slightly to find two men in suits standing there, badges clipped to their belts. They weren't local police. He knew immediately. These were internal affairs investigators sent from the state. Agent Johnson, one of them asked. Yes. Michael's voice was calm, steady. We'd like to speak with you about the incident at the precinct. Michael let them in. Carla sat up straighter on the edge of the bed, her arm instinctively wrapping around Maya, who had just woken. Ethan peered curiously from behind her. The investigators offered polite nods to the family before turning back to Michael. We've already reviewed the videos circulating online, the first investigator said. This is a serious matter. We want to hear your account of what happened directly from you. Michael glanced at his children, then gestured toward the small table by the window. Let's talk there. As he spoke, Carla whispered to the kids, keeping them calm. Michael recounted the entire chain of events, the stairs, the surveillance, the aggressive questioning, the baseless arrest. He didn't dramatize, didn't exaggerate. His voice was steady, clinical, almost like writing a report. But his words carried weight, and the investigators listened carefully, taking notes. When he finished, silence lingered in the room. Finally, the second investigator said, Everything you've described matches the evidence we've seen. This department has a serious problem. And now, thanks to those recordings, the entire nation knows it. Carla folded her arms. They didn't just arrest my husband. They scared my children. They made us feel like criminals when we were only on vacation. Her voice trembled, but her eyes burned. One of the investigators nodded respectfully. Mrs. Johnson, I assure you, your voice matters here. This won't be swept aside. After they left, Michael sank into the chair by the window, staring out at the waves. He knew this wasn't just an investigation anymore. It was a storm gathering force. By noon, he received another call, this time from a high-ranking official. In Washington, the man's tone was clear. Michael, you're at the center of a national conversation. The Bureau stands behind you, but this could escalate quickly. Are you prepared for that? Michael's reply was firm. Prepared or not, it's here, and I won't back down. Meanwhile, the police department across town was in chaos. Reporters crowded the front steps. Protesters gathered outside with signs that read, Justice for the Johnsons and End Racial Profiling. The officers involved had been suspended without pay, but the community demanded more. Firings, charges, accountability. Inside the precinct, the chief slammed a fist on his desk. How could this happen? How did none of you stop it? His words echoed through the hall, but no one had answers. The younger officers who had cuffed Michael avoided eye contact. Their faces pale. They had thought they were dealing with an ordinary family, easy to bully and dismiss. Instead, they had exposed the entire department. Back at the hotel, Michael tried to give his children a sense of normalcy. They went for ice cream, walked along the beach, and tried to laugh again. But everywhere they went, people recognized them. Some stopped to shake Michael's hand. Others hugged Carla, whispering words of support. The children received smiles of encouragement from strangers who told them, "You're so brave." One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Michael sat on the balcony with Carla. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you realize how big this has become?" she asked softly. Michael nodded. "Yes, and it's not about us anymore. It's about everyone who's been through this without anyone to defend them." Carla looked at him carefully. "So what are you going to do?" Michael's eyes hardened with resolve. "I'm going to make sure this doesn't disappear like so many other cases. I'll push for a full investigation, not just into those officers, but into the department's culture. If we let this fade, nothing changes." Carla smiled faintly. "That's the man I married." The next day, Michael sat down for an interview with a national news network. Dressed in a simple shirt, his posture straight and commanding, he told their story. Not as a victim, but as a witness, demanding accountability. His words were calm, professional, but powerful. "This isn't just about me," he told the camera. "It's about every family that has been humiliated, harassed, or treated as guilty without cause. It has to stop." The clip spread even faster than the original arrest videos. People across the country saw not only the injustice, but also the dignity with which Michael stood against it. His calm strength contrasted sharply with the aggression of the officers, and it resonated deeply. By nightfall, lawmakers began to weigh in. Some praised Michael's courage, calling for systemic change. Others scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. For the Johnson family, it meant their vacation was no longer theirs. It had become a symbol, a story that millions now followed. As Michael tucked his children into bed that night, Ethan looked up at him with wide eyes. "Daddy, are you a hero now?" Michael paused, brushing a hand over his son's hair. "No, buddy. I'm just a dad who stood up when it was time. Heroes are the people who keep fighting, even when no one's watching." But deep inside, he knew Ethan's words weren't entirely wrong. Something larger had begun. What started as a nightmare on vacation was now turning into a movement, and Michael Johnson was at the center of it, and the next step would decide just how far the reckoning would reach. The town's police department looked like a fortress under siege. Reporters lined the sidewalks with cameras pointed at the entrance, their voices rising as they shouted questions to every officer who walked in or out. Protesters gathered by the dozens, then by the hundreds, carrying signs that demanded justice. Accountability now, justice for the Johnson family, end racial profiling. The air outside the precinct pulsed with chants, drums, and anger. Inside, the atmosphere was even worse. The chief paced the floor, sweat beading on his forehead. He had spent decades building what he thought was a reputation of order. But now, that reputation lay in ruins. The arrest of the Johnson family had become a national scandal, and every decision he made was under the microscope. In Washington, the Department of Justice announced a formal investigation into the precinct. Internal. Affairs agents arrived daily, combing through body cam footage, arrest records, and officer reports. What they found shocked even them. Patterns of discrimination, repeated complaints ignored, and a culture where arrogance often replaced professionalism. And at the heart of it all was one name: Special Agent Michael Johnson. Michael hadn't asked to be the center of attention, but his face was now on every screen. News anchors described him as the calm, dignified father who had endured humiliation and then revealed himself to be an FBI agent. Social media platforms flooded with messages of support. Families from across the country shared their own stories of mistreatment, many saying, "If it could happen to an FBI agent, imagine what happens to the rest of us." Carla felt the weight of it more than anyone. She tried to shield Ethan and Maya from the noise, But even at the hotel, people stopped them with words of encouragement or sorrow. The children didn't fully understand the scale of what was happening, but they felt the change. Ethan asked his mother one night, "Why does everyone know us now?" Carla kissed his forehead softly. "Because what happened to us shouldn't happen to anyone, and people need to hear about it." Meanwhile, the suspended officers hid from the spotlight. Their names were leaked online, and videos of their actions were replayed endlessly. Neighbors whispered, friends distanced themselves, and even family members struggled to defend what they had done. What had seemed like just another day of asserting power over people who couldn't fight back had turned into the end of their careers. Michael, however, wasn't celebrating. He sat in the hotel room, reviewing documents and phone calls late into the night. His director had asked him to keep detailed records of everything: the arrest, the aftermath, the media coverage. Michael knew this wasn't just about personal justice. It was about building a case strong enough to create lasting change. One morning, he stood before the crowd outside the precinct. The mayor had invited him to speak at a press conference meant to calm the storm. The podium was surrounded by flashing cameras, the sea of protesters stretching into the street. Carla stood nearby with the children, her presence steadying him. Michael adjusted the microphone and began. His voice carried firm and clear. "What happened to my family is not just my story. It is the story of countless families who have suffered. In silence, we came here to rest, but instead we were treated as criminals for no reason other than the color of our skin. That is not policing, that is abuse of power." The crowd erupted with cheers. Michael continued, his expression solemn. "I'm an FBI agent, and I knew how to stay calm. I knew how to gather information and wait for the right moment to reveal the truth. But what if I had not been an agent? What if I had been just another father on vacation? What if my children had been left without protection? How many families do not have the chance to fight back?" The chants grew louder. Carla squeezed Ethan's hand as tears welled in her eyes. Maya clung to her mother, whispering, "Daddy's brave." Michael lifted a hand, calming the noise. "This is not the end. This is the beginning. The Department of Justice will investigate, but it cannot stop there. We need new training, new accountability, and a culture that values respect over suspicion. Until that happens, no family is truly safe." The press conference ended with thunderous applause. Reporters shouted questions, but Michael stepped away from the microphone, guiding his family through the crowd. He had said what needed to be said. That night, national news ran his speech in full. Commentators called it one of the most powerful statements on justice in years. Civil rights leaders reached out, asking Michael to join panels and discussions. Even lawmakers in Washington cited his words as a call to action. But in the quiet of the hotel room, Michael sat with Carla and whispered, "This fight isn't just on the news. It's in the hearts of our kids. They saw what happened. They'll carry it forever. I just hope we've shown them that standing up matters even when it's hard." Carla placed her head on his shoulder. "You've shown them more than that. You've shown them courage." Outside, the chants continued into the night. The Johnsons' vacation had turned into something far larger, a movement that refused to be silenced, and though the journey had been painful, Michael knew one truth with certainty: the reckoning had only just begun. The storm around the Johnson family did not fade. It transformed. What began as a humiliating arrest on a quiet vacation had grown into a nationwide conversation. For weeks, news outlets replayed the footage. Commentators debated the implications, and activists carried signs with the Johnsons' names. But for Michael, Carla, and the kids, the noise outside was only half the story. The real lesson lived within them. Back home, the children tried to return to their routines, but the memory clung to them. Ethan had nightmares of seeing his father in handcuffs. Maya often asked if the police were still mad at us. Carla spent hours reassuring them, explaining over and over what happened was wrong. but your dad made sure they can't do it again." She hugged them tighter than ever, determined to turn their fear into strength. Michael, meanwhile, found himself pulled into meetings and hearings. Internal Affairs had finished its investigation, and the findings were damning. The officers involved had histories of complaints, most ignored or buried. The department's practices showed patterns of targeting minorities, often without evidence. As the report was released publicly, the officers were formally fired. The chief, under immense pressure, resigned. For the first time in years, accountability wasn't just a word. It was reality. It was reality. But Michael didn't stop there. He testified before a congressional panel about policing standards, using his family's ordeal as proof of systemic failures. Cameras flashed, senators asked questions, and Michael answered each with calm authority. "I was able to protect my family because I understood the system," he said. "But the truth is, no family should need someone with my training or my badge to be treated with basic dignity. This is about humanity, not hierarchy." His words, echoed across the nation, quoted in newspapers and shared online. Carla watched from the sidelines with pride. She had seen her husband endure the humiliation of being treated like a criminal, yet he never once raised his voice in anger or lashed out. Instead, he carried himself with dignity, transforming their pain into power. To her, that was the greatest victory. In their neighborhood, people welcomed them home like heroes. Strangers knocked on their door with letters of support. Parents thanked Michael for speaking out, for giving a voice to what so many had lived through in silence. But Michael never saw himself as a hero. He saw himself as a father who had simply done what he had to do. One evening, weeks after the ordeal, the family sat together on the porch. The sky burned orange with sunset, and the air was filled with the sound of crickets. Ethan broke the quiet. "Dad, are the bad cops gone forever?" Michael looked at his son carefully. "Those officers won't wear a badge again, but remember, Ethan, it's not just about them. It's about making sure people who replace them are better. That's why we spoke up. That's why we fought back." Maya tilted her head. "So, will it happen again?" Michael's chest tightened, but he answered honestly, "Maybe. But every time we stand up, we make it harder for it to happen. And one day, I hope you'll live in a world where it doesn't." Carla reached over, taking his hand. "And when that day comes, our children will know they had a part in it. The lesson wasn't just about injustice, it was about resilience. The Johnsons had been forced into the spotlight, their private pain made public, but they chose to turn it into something greater. Their story became a symbol not of victimhood, but of strength. Months later, the town where it all began unveiled new reforms: mandatory bias training, independent oversight committees, and stronger community programs. Protesters who had once chanted outside the precinct now worked alongside city officials to rebuild trust. The Johnson family's ordeal had become the spark for change, not just in one department, but as a ripple that spread far wider. On the anniversary of the incident, Michael was invited to speak at a national conference on justice reform. Standing on stage, he looked out at the crowd and saw faces of all backgrounds: police officers, lawmakers, activists, families. He began with the same calm voice he had used the day of his arrest. "A year ago, my children cried as they watched me, handcuffed for no reason. Today, they stand here knowing that their tears helped ignite change. That's what justice is, turning pain into progress." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Michael didn't smile for recognition. He smiled for his children, who were watching proudly from the front row, knowing their family's suffering had not been in vain. Back at home, life slowly returned to something like normal. The laughter of Ethan and Maya once again filled the house. Carla planned another family trip, this time determined it would be filled with nothing but joy. Michael sat with her one evening and whispered, "Whatever happens next, at least our children know the truth. Dignity must always be defended." And so, the story of one family's ruined vacation became something far greater. It became a lesson for a nation, a reminder that justice is not a gift, but a fight, and that even in the face of humiliation and pain, strength can rise and change, can be born. The Johnsons would never forget the fear of that day, but neither would they forget the power of standing tall, together, when the world tried to break them.